firstly, welcome. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in Australia. We are recording this presentation today, so you will all be sent a copy of the recording within the next 48 hours. Yeah, so sorry about this. I will find out how to allow you to chat. And in the meantime, I think we will get started. We don't want to wait any longer. So firstly, I will introduce our two guest speakers today. We have Dr. Angad Singh, who is a builder. He's based in Perth, doing some wonderful properties, building some wonderful SDA properties over there. We've also got Brad Fuller, who is an SDA provider, joining us today. So they'll both be speaking. I will give a little introductory presentation on the data in the Perth region. Then I'll hand it over to Angad and Brad to give us their amazing knowledge on the Perth region and on SDA in general. And then at the end of that, we will have a Q&A session where we will try and answer as many questions as possible. So yeah, if you do have a question, you can put it into the Q&A box that's down the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and get those answered throughout the presentation, and any particular questions that come up at the end of the session we will address. So I'm going to just share my screen and start this presentation. Okay. So again, welcome on this webinar on how to invest in SDA in Perth. A little bit about NDIS Property Australia, if you don't know who we are. We are an advisory firm. We advise investors, builders, developers, providers, all stakeholders on SDA, constructing SDA, developing SDA around Australia. We are based in Brisbane, so we operate across the country, not just Perth either. We've sold around 200 dwellings over the last few years, and we expect there'll be another 100 that we sell over the next, this coming financial year. In the 3 years that we've spent doing this, we've learned how important it is to understand the SDA investment, all aspects of it really, to investors and the other stakeholders. So a lot of what we do is the data. We're very on top of where the demand is, where the supply is, and trying to determine where those gaps are in the market and the best places to build. So we do have a team of in-house research analysts working on that data continuously. We also have the SDA Housing Podcast, which has over 160 episodes now online, with 2 episodes published weekly. I think these stats might be a little bit old now, sorry. So we're getting over 3,000 downloads a month. So if you do have any questions on any aspect of SDA, head over to the podcast, and I'm sure that you will find an episode that will probably speak to you about your questions. So moving on into the Perth market, and we are really focused on Perth at the moment, I think mainly because it was the last state in Australia to bring on the SDA as the SDA scheme. It only really fully implemented in the last 2 years. So it's behind the other states in terms of development and also in terms of funding of SDA participants. So where are we currently in Perth? Well, we have a total of 1,639 participants who've got funding or are eligible for SDA in the Perth region. And the majority of them, as you can see, are actually in the southeast and the northwest. And there's quite a lot in the northeast and southwest as well. Now, when we look at the demand, we always want to look at the supply. So the supply includes all the enrolled places currently enrolled with the NDIA. And that is, I'm talking about places here, which basically means participant bedrooms in a home. So I've looked at the 197 enrolled dwellings in the Perth region, and we have 362 places there. Again, you can see them, the majority in the southeast and northwest and southwest. Now, a lot of those enrolled places around Australia are taken up by legacy and existing homes. What those are, legacy homes are the older style SDA dwellings that are 6 or more participants, so the big group homes, institutions. Now, there aren't a lot of those that have been enrolled in Perth, nor existing. There's a few, I think we've got a difference of about 60 dwellings. The existing SDA, again, are the old institutional type homes that have less than 6 participants living in them, so they have up to 5. What we do know is that the legacy and the existing are going to be over time defunded and brought out of the system so that everybody has a chance to live in a new build dwelling. So we're going to be concentrating on the new build places when I'm talking about this data moving forward. And in terms of the new build enrolled, so that's the properties that meet the new SDA design guidelines. They are 297 places, and those are spread over 182 dwellings. And that's an average of 1.63 places per dwelling currently in all new builds in the Perth region. Again, concentrated in the southeast, southwest, and northwest. Okay, so what's our undersupply looking like? Well, we've got, as we know, about 1,600 participants and to 300 places. So we're now looking at a undersupply of around 1,300 places in new build SDA dwellings. So if we're working on that 1.63 places per dwelling, that's around about 800 dwellings we need to be built for the current number of SDA funded participants in Perth. Now, I want to be really clear here that this is based on the current data. And when we look at the SDA demand moving forward, it's really important to also look at the overall NDIA participation and the projected number of participants coming into the system. So next slide, I'm just going to run through some numbers here. Current number of NDIS participants, 592,000. Now, the current number of NDIS participants in WA is just under 51,000. That's 8.61 in the whole of Australia. And with 1,800 SDA funded participants, that's 3.63. Now, the NDIA stated back when this all started that they expected 6% of all NDIS participants would require SDA funding. So if we look at that number of 6%, we're looking at potentially 3,000 participants and this is in all of Western Australia, needing SDA housing. Let's jump forward further, and by June 2032, the NDIA stated that over 1 million people will be in the NDIS. So based on those previous percentages, 8.61 would be about 87,500 in Western Australia. 3.63% being the current number of SDA funded participants, 3,180. And if we extrapolate that out to 6%, 5,200 participants potentially by 2032 need SDA housing in Perth. So if we've got a current gap of 1,300 places and a potential 3,600 places in the next 9 years, we are potentially looking at, I mean, this is obviously bringing this out right to the highest potential demand. We don't know where that number is going to fall, but we could be looking at around about 4,900 places, or approximately 3,000 dwellings required in Perth over the next 9 years. So that's a lot that we're talking about, and that is a lot of building that's got to be done to meet that demand. Now, just to let you know that in calculating these figures, we've not considered any known pipeline information. So when new build dwellings are at the planning stage, they need to get an SDA certification. And when that is done, the NDIA log that information in their database, and that's part of the quarterly data that is made publicly available on the NDIS website. So as I said here, if we include the known pipeline places, which we assume probably most of those will get built, maybe not all of them, but a good percentage certainly will. So 1,211 pipeline places. We're still looking at a demand of around 3,700 places needed in Western Australia. And I also want to mention that as we're only talking about the Perth region, that 94% of all dwellings in Western Australia are in the Perth-Mandurah region. So we could assume that out of that future demand, that we will need upwards of 2,100 dwellings in the next 9 years in Perth-Mandurah. So that is an overview of what we're looking at in terms of demand going forward in Perth. So I'm going to hand it over now to Angad, who's got a presentation he wants to run through us and talk about what they do, and lots of information about SDA in Western Australia. So over to you, Angad.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Very insightful data there. I might try and share my screen, and let's see if we can't get this working. Now, have we got, I can see there's lots of people here. Have we got the chat working yet? Let's see. I'd love if people can just ask questions as they come up, or if they've got any comments they can share. It'd be great to have an interactive session where we can tailor the content, I guess, to what people would really like to hear about. Let's see, we've got some questions here, and I think we've got some chat. Hopefully we get the chat going soon.
Yeah, we have some questions coming in the Q&A. I don't think the chat is working,
live yet,
but certainly any questions will be showing up in our Q&A.
Sure. Okay, we will get there. We will get there. Okay, is my screen coming up okay? Can everybody see that? Yes. Yeah, good.
We can
All right,
see it.
I see you nodding away. All right, brilliant. Let's get into it. Firstly, thank you for attending. A couple of fun facts about me, I guess, if you don't already know me. My name's Angad Singh. I actually started out my career as a dentist. I graduated from the University of Western Australia in 2009, and around the same time, I actually started developing real estate and became absolutely obsessed with property development overall. Shortly after that, my father and I, we co-founded a building company called Southern Constructions. That's our main operation today, and became a specialist in townhouses, villas, and about 5 years ago started looking at this SDA market. More recently, you might hear of us. We are carving out a separate brand just because SDA is becoming such a big part of what we do. So that brand is Nirvana Lifestyles, and you'll hear more about that as we come. And yeah, that's a little bit about us, about me. This is our amazing team, or part of it. These are our senior leaders at the team. We, by the way, we're a medium-sized construction company. We build around 50 to 60 houses a year, townhouses, villas, and SDA, typically in infill locations, although we do some greenfields as well. We have around 19 full-time staff, and we engage hundreds of contractors. What we offer is a fully integrated design, construct, estimation service for all forms of medium density property development. Now that includes townhouses in the inner city regions, and it includes SDAs and villas and other products of that nature. So 90% of all the builds that we do are done in-house. We do on occasion engage some delivery partners, particularly if we're engaging in constructions which are not in our geographical zone. And And that's basically what we do. All right, let's talk about some of the, I guess this is what we're going to be getting into. This is the meat of today. So SDA in Perth is very, very young. I'm sure many of you know that there's maybe a handful of completed stock. Yes, there's 182 dwellings enrolled, but very, very few are actually finished at this stage. As you know, the SDA design guidelines were only released in 2020. June 2020 is when they came into effect. And since then we've had COVID and everything's kind of been a bit up in the air. So even though we're at a place right now where we're seeing an enormous amount of SDA demand from participants and very low supply, and we're seeing a great need to transition people out of existing and legacy stock, what we are also seeing is that NDIS properties is kind of flavor of the month at the moment. And we are fully expecting a large amount of supply to be coming online over the next 12 to 24 months. And so the purpose of this discussion or this presentation was really to talk about some of the features, especially in the design of the dwelling, that can help your SDA stand out from the crowd and make sure that, when a participant has to choose, when there is some supply on the market, that your dwelling is the one that gets picked amongst all the others, right? So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going through some of the design features for safety and compliance, for the community and the homeliness of the dwelling. How do we create privacy and independence, which is incredibly important for participants? And the last one that always gets overlooked is some things about the function and utility of the dwellings, which is really, really important, particularly for the carers, and to make sure that the participants can get the service that they need for their day-to-day lives. Okay. After that, we'll go in through some of our packages that we have available, and also a step-by-step process of how to engage with us and what the build timeframes. And of course, at the end, we'll go into a full Q&A, and you can ask us anything. All right, let's get to it. Fire safety. Now, this is obviously, I guess, one of the points, one of the things that's constantly being discussed at the moment is the need for fire sprinklers in SDA dwellings. Now, I guess I just wanted to start. Sorry, let me just go back here. Now, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this particular case or this particular story, but this is the one that is floating around a lot in the news and in discussions around NDIS, in the discussions around the NDIA and SDA properties in particular. This picture that you see here on the bottom left of the screen, this is what was left of the Kew cottages after a fire started, and unfortunately 9 people lost their lives in this fire. Now, this fire happened at 10:56 p.m. on the 8th of April in 1996. And what's interesting about this fire is just before this actually happened, there had been many reports, many letters had been written to the government, effectively saying that the living conditions here were unsafe and that there needed to be some major upgrades to the building. The reason fire sprinklers were not in this building already was because the ceilings were made out of asbestos. Now, asbestos was used because at that time when they built this dwelling, there was a view that asbestos was non-flammable and therefore fire safe. So what ended up happening was one of the participants who was in one of these dwellings actually suffered from an intellectual disability, and with a cigarette lighter managed to light his bed sheets on fire. Now, he was sharing a room with 2 other people, and very, very quickly flames took over the whole house and the whole room, and eventually spread over to the rest of the house. Now, what's important to recognize, by the way, is that the people that died, or the people that were the victims of this, were actually those that suffered from an intellectual disability. They are the people that would likely be funded to an improved livability standard today. And I think that's important to understand, because many people are arguing that fire safety is really only important for high physical support. Simply not the case, I don't think. In this particular building, 9 out of the 10 people died. And that's a very, very high death rate. And every one of those people died within 6.5 minutes of that fire being ignited, which means that the guys that were there really, really never stood a chance. And this is despite outstanding speed and courage from the staff and the fire brigade. Now, fire brigade was there within 4 minutes of the fire alarm being raised. The unfortunate thing is, it took almost 8 minutes, 7 minutes and 45 seconds from the time of ignition that the fire alarm actually went off. And this is typical of buildings, or typical of, when the fire safety of a building isn't done up to spec. Now, this is not an isolated case, by the way. There are other cases in history that are the same, and what tends to happen is we forget about them, and so we repeat them. Recently, this happened in an aged care centre as well, which was on the news. And it's because of these cases that the National Construction Code, they already mandate that in the case of what they term as a residential care building, where more than 10% of the persons who reside there need physical assistance in conducting their daily activities and to evacuate the building, they require fire sprinklers as of right. It's already mandatory for all of the buildings that generally are providing care. Now, SDA fits into a unique category, and we'll talk about that in a minute. However, it's very, very important to understand why this is becoming so important and what that means for people. Now, this is a hot topic, and what we are seeing is that there's an increasing number of SIL and SDA providers that are worrying that they may be held liable for injury or loss of life if they are putting people in dwellings without sprinklers or appropriate fire safety. There's an increasing number of SIL and SDA providers who are simply refusing to take houses without sprinklers. And we also know that there's an increasing pressure from lobbying bodies such as the SDA Alliance to essentially mandate sprinklers throughout all categories of all SDA. Now, this is something to really watch closely, guys, by the way, because the NDIA has already announced that they're going to be reviewing the SDA design standard. They've already announced that they're no longer releasing any more clarification notes, and that this is going to go into a formal review. And it's quite possible that this will become mandatory in the not too distant future, likely implemented within the next 6 to 8 months. We are also starting to see, by the way, in WA, there was a recent story where now local councils are actually refusing applications for Class 1 SDA. And the only way that they're going to let them through is with a statutory declaration from the SDA provider that the people that are going to be living in these dwellings would not need assistance in evacuating, which obviously no SDA provider can, hand on heart provide because, well, they're SDAs. Okay, so this is something to keep a very close eye on. Now, let's talk about the fire safety that needs to go into some of these dwellings and what we recommend as a standard. Now, in order to achieve compliance, we typically recommend that you go with what's called a Class 3 residential care building. That's when the building has more than 10% of the participants that would require care and evacuation. However, there are other things as well that are very helpful for the safety of participants, as well as to make sure in the case of a fire that people can evacuate, right? So the first thing is having open plan areas with very clear lines of sight. Now, when it comes to fire safety, one of the things with a Class 3 fire safety system is it's quite different to saying, listen, let's just get a Class 1 building, let's do a basic residential house and chuck in some fire sprinklers. It's not the same. A Class 3 fire system has to hit a certain Australian standard such that, number one, there's a detection and alarm system that goes off at the appropriate time, and that the fire department, or what we call DFES in WA, Department of Fire and Emergency Services, is automatically informed when that happens. In the case that you saw before, remember, everybody was dead in 6.5 minutes. And it took 7 minutes and 45 seconds for the alarm to even go off. If that alarm system is not at an appropriate standard, there's just no way people are getting out of the building. Another thing to really take note of is that most fires do actually happen in the middle of the night or late at night. And because of that, it's not that someone may not notice that a fire's happened until 3 or 4 minutes. And in the case before, within 10 minutes, there's 20-meter high flames. So these things accelerate very, very quickly. So I think that understanding the fire and safety inclusion, not just the sprinklers, but also the detection, alarm system, the DFES monitoring, all of that is really quite important, and it's becoming increasingly important for people who are, taking it on and living in these dwellings. Another important feature that I think is quite easy to do and quite relevant is actually ensuring that the bedrooms themselves have direct access to the outside. Now, remember, in a fire, most fires start in bedrooms, That's quite typical. Someone's left a heater on and put something in front of it that's flammable or something like that, or a candle's dropped, or a cigarette lighter has lit something on fire. But that's actually that's pretty much where you expect the fire to start. And the most fire fatalities actually happen due to smoke. It's not the fire itself that kills people, it's actually the smoke that happens. So simply providing a safe and easy exit is really like a great feature. And ideally, once you leave that room, you can exit the dwelling in a safe manner and get away from the fire. Okay, if you want to know more about fire sprinklers, Min and I have done a podcast. It's episode 120 of the SDA Housing Podcast, where we talk about this at length. So you can check that out if you're interested. All right, tip number 2, community and homeliness. Now, one of the things that we're seeing in SDA is that there's a strong focus on the SDA compliance, and there's not a lot of conversation happening around what is architectural best practice. So I guess this is what makes the house livable, not necessarily for a participant, but for anyone who's living in that house. So these things include things like solar passive principles, right? So for us, we've got a courtyard towards the north, ideally on a south-facing block. We've got private courtyards on the east. This is where the great morning sun comes out, and this is where you get beautiful sunlight during the winter months in particular. In WA, the west side of the house tends to be quite hot. This is where we keep the boundary walls and try to only have very small glazing in these sections, and make sure that there's plenty of windows and plenty of cross ventilation that can occur to keep the house both warm in the winter and cool in the summer. These, I guess this is just good manners in architecture. And we would really like to see more of this in SDA. Another little feature is just keeping everything really, really simple. That ensures that compliance is easier to achieve. It also produces a great, elegant feel when you're walking through the dwellings. And every little nook and cranny is basically utilized. So you can see we've got some storage here. You can see this is pretty much the only corridor in the house. The laundry is tucked away neatly. It's all neat and clean, and there's very little dead space in this particular house. For the living areas, it's very important that in these dwellings in particular, that we create an environment where people can engage in community activities. I was having a chat with Brad earlier about the importance to create an inclusive feel and make sure that people are engaging with other human beings and create a sense of connectedness within these dwellings. In order to do that, it's really important that the living area facilitates that type of interaction. Also, light and bright, making sure that the furniture layout is conducive to group activities and is practical and functional, and making sure that the outdoor living area is well connected to the living area, so people can freely move indoor, outdoor, and really creating that sense of connection between the two spaces. For our improved livability products, by the way, one little tip or point, which I guess you could class as best practice, is just the width of the hallways and corridors and the doors and the door spaces. Now, the current SDA compliance for the corridors is only 900 mil, and for the doors is only 850 mil clear. What we're identifying is, for the comfort of the participants and the ease of access throughout the dwelling, this really needs to be at least 1100 for hallways and corridors, and probably 1020 for doors. So just a little tip there that you can start looking for when you are taking out, or when you are getting these designs. This is an example of a living area in one of our dwellings. You can see that there's plenty of glazing. You can see that it flows nicely, neat neutral colors, all the rest of that. And of course, we like to have a nice outdoor living area, and crucially making sure that there's a nice connected feel between the indoor and outdoor living spaces. Number 3, privacy and independence. Now, by the way, guys, the participants, in my view, are really guiding us as to what types of housing they want to see. Now, we know on the Housing Hub that 44% of all searches are for single occupancy dwellings. What we're seeing, broadly speaking, is that people don't like to share. And this is true not just for people with disabilities, it's actually true for many other people too. And because of that, we are seeing a strong preference for 2-participant homes compared to 3-participant homes. In fact, most of what we're building at the moment is just 2-participant homes. And this desire for privacy and independence really seems to be front and center of what we're seeing. This, by the way, so we regularly engage with different care providers, and we run little groups where we ask participants what their thoughts are and things like that. And this seems to be broadly supported by the people that we're talking to. And interestingly, now we at this point are actually prioritizing the bedroom spaces and making them larger, large enough to accommodate, you know, if a family member comes over, they can sit in the bedroom and there's a nice couch rather than a tight little bedroom. We're starting to create that environment more and more in the bedrooms than trying to include second living areas. Not saying that second living areas aren't great, and certainly where you have the space, it's always a great idea to do it, especially in a 3-participant home. But really having a focus on this, you know, shared independent living style, similar to what we see in boarding houses or houses of multiple occupants, such that the bedroom is sufficient that someone can have a couch and play video games and have a computer desk or have a little keyboard or things like that. So it's very unlikely, by the way, that a participant, even if they want privacy and independence, it's very unlikely that they'll get funded to a single occupant level. So creating these spaces, we believe, is really our role to support, you know, the needs of both the participants and the NDIS to not only hit the budgets that they need, but also create the type of environment that people want to live in. In order to do that, you really, really need to give people more space. The compliance requirements at the moment for an IL bedroom are 3.1 by 3.1 meters. I think at this moment we're doing, you know, 3.7 by 5. That's literally double the size of compliance, and we think even that, if you can, it would be worth being a little bit more generous. Really taking into consideration how the furniture is going to lay out, where the TV is going to go, making sure that if they want to, they could retrofit a kitchenette. These are all really important features when you're considering how the bedroom layout is going to go. And remember, whilst we're creating a shared living environment, we do want to create separation from an acoustic perspective. So the way that we do that is we try not to have back-to-back bedrooms. Yeah. So yes, they're still acoustic bricks and they're still insulated. However, it's much better to make sure, where you can, to separate the habitable areas with the bathrooms so that you're not getting overflow of noise and, you know, a crossover of noise pollution. Okay. I think by now everyone has come to the same agreement that private en-suites are absolutely essential, that shared bathrooms are just not happening. And we are starting to also see a strong preference for private courtyards. So, you know, that is something that isn't in a lot of designs yet, but we are seeing that for participants, this is becoming increasingly important. When people want to be as a group, they can be as a group. When they want to be alone, they can either enjoy an indoor or an outdoor environment by themselves. So yeah, a couple of little features there. These are some of our bedrooms. This is for an improved livability design. And you can see the TV. This seems to be so important, by the way. One of the most important requests that we get is actually a TV in the bedroom. These are the private outdoor living areas so that people can stay outside if they want to have a cigarette or just sit there and read a book, whatever the case may be. And then these are the bathrooms. So neat, clean. One feature about the bathroom I will just draw attention to is actually the storage. A lot of the bathrooms, what we're seeing is that there just hasn't really been a consideration of where people are going to put stuff. And the 1400 robe, the 1600 robe that's required by compliance just isn't enough. So allowing for some space so they can aftermarket, you know, get an IKEA cupboard or something, or some shelving or whatever they really want is something that I think is also, you know, quite important. Now that was an improved livability house. A couple of things for high physical support that I believe are not required but really help set the dwelling apart is, firstly, the bedrooms are even bigger. So in this case, the bedrooms are 4.3 by 5.8 meters. And the purpose is really to facilitate that shared independent living, that studio style. There is enough space to put a kitchenette in these bedrooms, or you could put some couches, or you could do whatever, you know, basically make it your own, you know, live in it how you want to. There is also a possibility or a capability to put a hoist through the bathroom if you want to. Now, these are all built in double brick, and the hoist design will come down to the individual and the care provider on how they want to do that. They could put a H-track, or they could put something like this. It's really flexible. Our job as SDA developers and investors is to create flexibility so that the ultimate users, the carers and the participants, can create the situation that's most optimum for them. And, you know, we actually leave this door open, but we can put a door in as well. It's not difficult. It just depends on what the needs of the individual and the carers are. A couple of little tips that aren't really discussed: having some wheelchair charging bays in the garage. Obviously, the adjustable bench tops and the automation provisions people know about, but really including some extra little features like the wheelchair charging bays or things like that really goes a long way. We do know that there is a requirement for home automation or at least the provisions for home automation in high physical support dwellings. And this IT cupboard tends to get put in very awkward places. Remember, this thing makes a lot of noise. So some people put it in the living area or in the carers or in the OOA. But with those fans buzzing away, it's actually quite irritating and annoying. So it's quite important that you consider where that IT cupboard is going to go, so that it doesn't, you know, disturb people as it whirls away. For high physical support, you know, the requirements again, 1200 and 950, just not enough is what we're seeing. The door sizes that we're doing pretty much throughout the dwelling, certainly to all participant rooms and everywhere the participant needs to go, is at 1200. Now that's a big increase, but that really makes it very, very easy to maneuver. And the hallways at the narrowest point are around 1400. This is much larger. I think this is probably more like 1800 or maybe even 2 meters, and 1400 at the narrowest points. It's just because it just gives people, you know, that feel that they've got space and that they're not cramming through little corners. Okay. One point about the shower, which we didn't say, is that even though, you know, that the capacity of the shower should be that it can include a shower bed. So these en-suites are probably twice the size of what compliance is. However, from the feedback that we're getting from our carers and our participants is simply that, you know, you just need the space. This is the kitchen for a HPS dwelling. You can see that there's adjustable bench tops, and you can see side opening ovens and things like that. And then really just making sure it looks nice, high quality fixtures and fittings. We use Hayfully throughout, which is one of the top brands, and really trying to create a high quality design outcome. This is the bedroom. You can see that they've got a big 1200 door to exit outside if they want to, and of course a private ensuite. This is their ensuite. So again, we've tried to give some storage. We do have some space on the other side for some aftermarket storage if required. All right, and the last little tip that I guess we wanted to go through is the one that's most overlooked, and it's actually the biggest complaint that we see from carers in particular. Now remember, if your carers are happy, they take care of the participants and the participants are happy. If the carers can't do their job because the dwelling doesn't allow them, that does ultimately lead to a poorer quality outcome for the participants and less happy people in the dwelling overall. So this to me is something, you know, even when we do custom homes or any development, this is always the thing that gets looked at last. And so we always want to make sure that upfront in the design phase, we are considering how the dwelling will be used and making sure that, you know, the utility is not an afterthought. It's actually front and center of the design. So storage. Now the NDIS SDA design standard requires a 600 mil storage cupboard. It's just not enough. It's not even close. That's probably the minimum requirement for your lockable storage. However, I think you need at least a couple of linen cupboards, 2 meters wide. Remember, you have linen, you have bedding, you have towels, upholstery maybe. You might want to store some board games for community activities. There's so much stuff, and this is really where it needs to live. So the storage requirement, I think, needs to be tripled or maybe even quadrupled, and also having a number of different types of storage. So in the garage, for example, you might have some shelves, you might have some linen cupboards, you might have some private storage in the bathrooms. You know, it's about creating the space so that people can use it. We often get told, by the way, is not to fit out these shelves. We just leave the space, because then carers can adapt that space and put get furniture or get a cupboard or get some shelves or whatever is best for them. But our job is to make sure that the space is there and it can easily be retrofitted with something that suits. Because we do use the garage as storage, it's quite important to have a lock-up garage and provide at least one carer bay and one off-street visitor bay. In this case, you can see there's more than that, but that's, I would consider, a minimum. take care of your carers, giving them a large space. Now, often they're not sleeping in these dwellings, but they might have a little bit of a rest, and they might need to get on a computer, and they might need to take a bath, or they might need to, use the bathroom. And I think providing them with a separate space is quite important. They will also have rotations, so you may actually have 2 carers in the dwelling at a time. So that's why we opt for a separate bath rather than an ensuite. And then, and other utility things like your laundry. So the laundry, by the way, runs a lot in these houses. Often it's just running all the time. So trying to make it away from the participant sleeping areas is quite important. We will often insulate this with acoustic bricks, but the key point is so that it doesn't disturb the sleep of the people, and it's easily accessible from the hallway. Sometimes you can put this in the garage. That works quite well too. And then the clothesline, which is up here at the back. Now, the clothesline really, remember, in order to maintain, I guess, the dignity of the participants, you just don't want their clothes on show. So trying to keep it tucked away so that when people are enjoying, some sunshine in the alfresco, it's not directly in their line of sight. So just doing the best that you can to provide some separation there. All right. Hopefully that was helpful. Going through a few little tips. I'll go through very briefly the packages that we provide, and then a little bit about our process. So this is our first package. This is our improved livability package. Now, remember, improved livability does form a very large portion of the market, and so this is a product that we offer. Now, our improved livability packages come in 2 forms. The first form is the Class 1 package. It's still got the floor plan that we've just gone through, and it still has all of the nice inclusions, fixtures, and finishings with the high quality brands that we use. The only difference between these 2 packages is that this one is a Class 1 building, which means there are no sprinklers, and this one is a Class 3 building, which means there are sprinklers and the best-in-class fire safety that we discussed. Now, this is the only package that we will do without sprinklers. And the reason we do this package without sprinklers is we understand that some investors have a budget. That's very important. And if at least our design has some of the other safety features, like the direct exits from participant rooms, the direct lines of sight, and those types of things. So in many ways, we feel like it's better that if you're going to buy something without sprinklers, at least get something that's got some other safety measures, and still provides a great amenity for the participants. And you can see, by the way, the build price on this is $499, and the build price for this is $559. So the upgrades are almost done at cost. So we really want to encourage you to just include all those fire safety upgrades as you can. Another thing about this particular design, by the way, is that it is quite easy. There's plenty of ceiling space to retrofit the sprinklers, and it wouldn't be that difficult if you were to do it at the end of the build or after, in case that does become a mandatory requirement, and there is a need to retrofit. Having said that, obviously we always recommend that people go with sprinklers in the first pass. It makes it easier. It's, SEAL providers love it, SDA providers love it, and it's providing the best outcome for participants. Plus, there has been an increase in the funding as well to kind of accommodate this. Okay, so package number 1, build price is $499. You can get land from around $185, and packages start from around that $685 range. Now, just to let you know, by the way, this is not a recommendation of how much you should spend on the land. What we always advise is that having access to better locations and better blocks will set your product apart. So especially a block, like say, for example, it's across the road from a park and near to local amenity, that's always going to be favored over a block that's bog standard in the middle of nowhere. Does that make sense? So really, we always encourage people to pick a product that's the best product within their budget, rather than trying to go for the cheapest product that they have access to, if that makes sense. So yeah, so that's our two improved livability packages, starting around $685 and $745. This is by far our most popular package. This is our high physical support package. It's our 2-participant high physical support. In order to get this package, you do need a slightly larger block size than before. So 12.5 by 30, which is a very common block size, by the way. The reason this package is so popular is because it can basically do all of those categories: improved livability, fully accessible, and high physical support. And because of the design, we still get strong feedback from providers and participants that it's highly desirable, and it's very versatile in that you can really, find a great estate, find a great block, and find a location that, with you and your provider, that what that looks like, that works for you. So once again, land is available around Perth from 206. However, the better locations are going to do better and perform better in the long term, regardless of what that yield is. And the last little types of packages that we do is, what we're finding is that, there's a lot of these standard model packages for high physical support and improved ability that are out there, and often people are getting ignored. The participants that are already in these legacy and existing dwellings, for them to stay in that area, there really needs to be a bespoke design solution for a local council or a local development or a site that's not your bog standard. So we often will collaborate with providers to move their existing participants into more appropriate accommodation. This is really, really relevant, especially in the robust space where, people are in very inappropriate accommodation at the moment. There isn't a lot of stock coming online. The problem with these, the robust funding at the moment hasn't really got the kick that we were hoping for. So the returns tend to be lower, but at the same time, the participants need these dwellings. So we do prepare packages like these. These are done on a limited release, if you will. They're not standard packages. When we have a need from a provider, we put something together and engage investors for that. So these are the 4 packages. You've got packages starting from $685 for our Class 1 improved livability, $745 for Class 3 improved livability, and then $875 and up for our high physical support. And then, on occasion, we do have a limited biller or something like that comes through, and they tend to range from about 600,000. Here's how it works. Now, our packages, we don't have like hundreds of packages that are just waiting there for people to buy, by the way. There's a bit of a boom going on in Perth. Blocks are moving incredibly quickly. There's a very, very strong demand from first home buyers and investors alike, not just SDA, but all types of investment. I'm sure you've seen the news. So our packages are typically made to order. What the first step to engage is to essentially contact Min and the team and have a consultation with them and see if what we offer might be right for you. After that, they will support you in preparing an expression of interest, which once you send to us, that's when we get started. And what we do is firstly we go through a finance consult to verify the budget and essentially your brief, so you can let us know if you've got any preferred locations or if you've got a provider that you'd like to work with or anything in particular. And then once we know the budget and the brief, then we actually make a package that's suitable for you. Now, obviously, all the packages are pre-certified. We always get feedback from our providers before we put a package together. We've got, several providers that we're constantly in discussion with, giving us feedback about locations, about demand, about, design improvements. I mean, what you're seeing today, by the way, is probably version 75,000 of the plans, and we're trying to get better and better every single time we build these things. So when we put a package together, at that point, that's when we get all the, everything, all the ducks lined up, so to speak, send it to you for review. And if you're happy with that, then we move on to a building contract and a land contract. And of course, once that's done, it's the usual 5K for the land and 6.5% for the build. And off we go. Let's talk about the building timeframes, because this is something that comes up a lot. Now, we're not in the heat of the labor shortage and the trade shortage as we were before. We're certainly, builds are certainly starting to move a lot faster. Certainly the single story stuff is moving a lot faster, but it's very important to understand that with a Class 3 build in particular, there is a significant lead time because you also need approval, not only from the local council, but from the Department of Fire and Emergency Services. So that does take time, and that needs to be factored in. So we basically here, imagine that we started today. We basically kick things off on our end when the construction deposit is paid. Now, you can choose, by the way, to pay that immediately on signing of the contract, or if you want to, you can wait until the finance is approved and the land is settled. That's really up to you. Obviously, you have already had a finance consultation, so honestly, I've never seen a deal fall over after the contract is signed. However, I'll be guided by you as to what your preferred when you'd like us to get started, basically. After that, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks to get to that point that we have all of those preliminary approvals in place. So this is where we get all of our compliance certificates. This includes your SDA pre-construction certificate. This includes your Department of Fire and Emergency Services, and it includes all of the other, estate approvals or certificate of design compliance for all of the other things that we need to do. The longest thing, or the thing that basically defines this timeline, is the DFS approval. If we didn't have to deal with DFS for these, we would be done in maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and we're off to a building permit, sometimes less. Once that's all done, that allows us to lodge for a building permit. Typically, building permits are taking anywhere between 1 and 3 weeks. So, sometimes they're quicker, sometimes they're a bit longer, but 10 days is pretty much the standard time. And once we have the building permit, we are now ready with all of the documents that we handed over to our construction team, and off they go. After we hand it to the construction team needs some time to plan everything and make sure that all the orders and things are in place. And they're generally commencing on site within 2 to 4 weeks of us giving them all the final documents. So that's when they're physically breaking ground, they order everything, and they actually get the trades there. From there, another 2 to 4 weeks and we get the slab down, and the entire build, can take anywhere from, let's say, 8 to 10 months. Now, we are seeing that timeline come back. When we were building houses before all of the COVID, the grants and the COVID crisis, we were knocking these out in like maybe 5.5 to 6 months from slab down. I think we're heading in that direction. However, we're still trying to let people know that, look, we don't exactly know what snags we might hit along the way. Sure, we're not seeing, bricklayer waiting 3 months for bricklayers or anything crazy like that. But what we're still finding is that the high quality trades are still in demand. And because compliance is so critical and quality is so critical, it's worth waiting a week or two just to make sure that you get the right tiler rather than someone who's never done a property like this before. All in all, the process takes anywhere between 11 and 13 months on average. And, that is a pretty realistic, I guess, expectation. Sometimes it's a bit less, and yes, we will start to see these taking 9 to 10 months from the time the contract is signed, but we're probably not quite there yet. Another thing to mention is when we start this period, by the way, is up to you. So if you imagine we start when the deposit's paid, sometimes we can actually make up 4 months just because the time frame, we can make up 2 or 3 months in the finance and settlement. It's always a good idea to have your provider engaged at slab down because that allows them time to market the property and identify the participants. We know that when a participant needs modification, that's generally going to happen in the fixing stage. So it's great to have all the participants identified at the roof cover stage so that we can take on all those modifications at that stage. And then really making sure that all the handover and activation comes together during the completion so that we can try to have a smoother transition as possible. So that your provider can take over and activate the dwelling. All right, guys, that's it from me. Thank you very much for your time. I guess I'll hand over now to Brad to take it from here.
All right, thanks very much for that. Hi, everyone. I'm Brad. I'm an SDA provider. I've been involved with well over 140 people now in our world, and also in Perth I've been working with a substantial number of investors over there. What I'd like to talk to you about today is the role of the SDA, and what I want to encourage you to do is look at this from the investor's eyes. And it's something that I talk to a lot of people who are helping us build houses, the investors, and that help that we need to put houses on the ground right now is needed across Australia. So if I could start by talking about the location, and I know that's been discussed today, but that's one of the critical things. Of course, for you and I, we would choose our houses and we would have restrictions with our financial ability, how much money we've got in the bank. But of course, there would be other factors, schools. It would be, are we near facilities or amenities? Do we like to live on the beach? For participants, they still have all those criteria to tick. But of course, participants don't have the financial restrictions that you or I might do. They can choose the house purely based around its functionality, its location. Does it suit their needs? Are the hospitals close? Are there shopping centres nearby? Are there accessible parks or infrastructure that is suitable for lifestyle activities? So on top of that, it's very important that the location for a participant is made so that the house in that area follows and they can take advantage of all the infrastructure around it. Now, of course, everyone does the data. I know that Debbie does excellent data from their perspective, but the data on the NDIS website, which we all need, unfortunately is a little flawed because it only comes every 3 months and 3 months in arrears. So everybody is trying to make sure that we've got more effective data off the ground to give the best indication of where the demand is. I mean, there's no point in building a house in an area where there is no demand. And so if we're going to service the needs of all participants across Australia, then of course we need to be really focused on that. And all the people speaking here today are certainly focused on that. We need houses in particular areas, and we do a lot of data research to do that. But on top of that, in SDA, we also speak to a lot of the stakeholders, the OTs, the support coordinators and planners, the SIL providers, supported independent living, the carers for those in layman terms. And we get data off the ground from those guys as well to know exactly where they need to place participants across Australia. And this just helps us give better advice as to where the home should be built. Now, the next phase, of course, is what we've been talking about, is the design of the house. And that is absolutely critical because the functionality of the house is one thing, the cosmetic appearance is another, also the layout and how participants would use that layout to have the best life they can have. So in terms of design, we've had and seen so many different designs over the years. But when we first started in this world, most of the houses that were being built were quite small. They were on, even going back 3 years ago, quite cheap blocks of land compared to today, but the houses were small. Now, NDIS has a compliance standard for housing, which is a minimum standard compliance. And of course, every house that you'd be dealing with would be that. But like in every home, as we've been talking about, you can add features and functionality to a basic home. And of course, participants will acknowledge that as being more fit for purpose. And that's the new terminology out there. The house needs to be fit for purpose. And of course, as we've discussed, we want a participant to choose your house over the other 20 or 30 or 40 that will definitely be in the same suburb over the next 3 to 10 years. And the only way to do that is to take care and consideration about the design and functionality of that home. And we've had a lot of input from participants over the years so we've got a pretty good idea of what functionality and layout is required. And it's interesting that sometimes there is some confusion. There's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of myth out there about how this works. And look, the complications are sometimes from the very organizations that work in it. I mean, the NDIS guidelines for building, as Angad would say, often collide with the building codes in certain areas. And a really good example of that is that a lot of houses don't have fire escapes, if you like, a fire egress down the side of the house. Now, when an NDIS certifier comes to that house, they just do this because it's not a compliance, it's not a compliance item. So morally, we definitely should have an access down the side of the house, as you've seen, a way out in case there's a fire. And that is a huge topic going on everywhere across Australia at the moment. But it's interesting to note that compliance says you don't have to have one. Whereas what we've discovered is sometimes when SIL providers bring their participants to the home and they have to have like an audit from the insurance companies, some of the insurance companies are saying, where's the fire egress? What if there's a fire in the garage or at the front door? We need to have an egress out of the rear of the house and down the side and out through the garden gate. Now, is that a compliance issue? Unbelievably, it's not. But is it the correct, moral, and safest thing to do? 100%. Why the NDIS certifiers following code? It's not on their checklist, but we want to ensure that we are doing the right thing and providing that access. So our objective is to put no barriers up to a participant choosing your house. And in fact, we would like that home to be a shining star, have facilities and functionalities and location better than any other house, and so that your house will be chosen before the others. And that is our ethos, and that is our goal as an SDA provider. And of course, on the location of these homes, everybody would live as close to the beach or to the water or into the inner city as you could. And if I suppose I could tell you, if you can think back to when you were a first home buyer, if we might even have some in the audience, but we all wanted to live in the heart of the city or on the beach or by the river or in a location that we actually probably couldn't afford at those times. So what we ended up doing was we ended up just going out a suburb or two into an area where our financial resources were compatible with the land or the home that we were buying. Now, if today, what's a great example? So on the, let's say in Perth, because we're talking about that, if you built me a house in Perth, say in Fremantle, looking out over the water, how do you reckon my tenancy risk would be? So of course, everybody listening here is really interested in one really big elephant in the room, and that is the tenancy risk. How do you control that your home will have tenants at the end of the day? Now, if you were to build me a house in Fremantle on the water, I can guarantee you nearly that I would have a queue up of people wanting to live in that home because of its location. Of course, financially, that may be a possibility that nobody can reach, or if you do, of course, the ROIs would be quite lower. So given that we know participants would prefer to live in close to the major infrastructure, what is happening is, though, the homes that are being built are usually not in those areas. So just when participants apply for their funding to live in a certain area, at times they work out that, unfortunately, there are no houses in that area. Therefore, they have to do what you and I did when we were younger and move out to the next suburb out, come out a little bit to where the homes are being built by people who are trying to help us with that construction. And of course, at times, if that's the only house that's available, participants are coming to those areas. And of course, that's what we're trying to map. As Debbie said, the demand is quite high in Perth, and we're seeing a lot more participants being funded into that area. And also at the same time, Perth is only quite new because Perth is the last of the Australian states to be activated as by the NDIS. I think Melbourne was in 2015, Queensland in 2019, and Perth, unfortunately, came online right in the middle of COVID, and we're all probably aware of the lockdowns that went on through that period. So in some ways, Perth has been restricted in the same growth that we have witnessed in the eastern states. So Perth has certainly got a long way to go, and the number of participants that are funded through Australia, there is still a massive amount yet to come through the pipeline. And of course, a lot of the data looks at people who are just funded. One thing you need to realize is when you're weighing up, what is my tenancy risk? Well, there are a lot of participants yet to be funded. And in Perth, we're only just starting. So we do expect that there will be a huge growth of people coming through the pipeline, but also you need to consider that there are people also caught in hospital beds, $1 million a year in a hospital, people who are caught in aged care facilities where you have 18-year-olds mixing with 80-year-olds. And of course, there's been commitments to try and get those people out of aged care, those who are eligible for SDA, of course, because not everyone is in aged care. But of course, you've got the legacy homes. Now, there are many people that don't realize that SDA has been around for a very long time, like nearly 30 years. And the government's been building SDA, 4 to 10 bedroom homes for a very long time, but they have reviewed them every 5 years. And I think in 2013, at the 5-year review, it was decided that the system was quite broken. Now, when investors hear this 5-year review, the questions I'm always receiving is, oh, Brad, does that mean they can take the money away? Will the money be diluted? But that wasn't what it was about. The 5-year review was always about, does the system need more money? And of course, in that early 5-year review, when they decided the system was quite broken and it needed a lot more money, that really led to the birth of the NDIS, as we know it, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is managed by the NDIA, the National Disability Insurance Agency. If people are confused about that, it's really like a barrister administers the Queensland, New South Wales, Western Australian law. The law is the paper, the barrister administers that. So the NDIA is really administering the paper that is the NDIS. So what we had was, as evidence to that, in the recent 5-year review in March, you would have noticed, I'm sure everyone is aware, that there's been significant increases in funding. And that has led to, in my mind, a de-risk of this investment. So prior to the 1st of July, there was a different level of funding. Post 1st of July 2023, we have some new levels. So I would like to think that all people out there who are thinking of building a home to help us provide housing for people with disability would think now that they can comfortably do this, knowing that, you know, you can do some community good here on the left, but also get a good return for what you're doing on the right. And that makes probably for one of the best investments that you could have in 2023. So that's been our ethos, is to provide, of course, I'm like a broken record, provide the best location you can, provide a design that participants will choose over any other house that's there. And so be guided by our data, be guided by the design elements that we know work. And of course, the third element is to make sure you choose the right SDA provider. Now, I want to speak to that a little bit, because there are many SDA providers out there who probably come from a property background and wouldn't have spent much time in the disability sector. So one of the early questions to ask your SDA provider is, how long have you spent advocating for the needs of vulnerable people? You know, this is something that people don't realize, that participants choose the provider. And of course, you as investors also choose the provider. Now, where we have been successful in this sector is that participants, when they sit with providers, they certainly want to understand that they're talking to someone who understands the language of disability. I could say to you all, whatever business you are in, if you sat with a person who claimed to be in your business or doing what you do, I'll bet in 15 minutes, by the phraseology, the terminology, the stories they told, the question and answers that you engaged in, you would know pretty much very quickly whether they were actually in your business. You would unveil them quickly if they weren't. So when participants sit with providers who don't speak that language of ability, who haven't had strong history in disability and advocacy, they unveil you very quickly. And so also, more so, some participants who may have complex needs will have supports around them who may be making decisions on their behalf. Now, those people really unveil providers who don't have that background, because from us, potentially, I do all the first calls to all the investors who are hoping to build a house to help us. And I can tell you that that's a long conversation. That's probably 45 minutes to an hour. And I'm trying to précis some of the key elements in it now for you. But of course, participants will choose a provider who they feel for the next 20 years will be shielding them in that house. So our mandate as an SDA provider is to provide the best life for a participant that can be given. So we're monitoring that house for everything that may affect the participant's world. We monitor the carers, we monitor the participants and their interactions. Also, in that system, we need to be responsive to that as well. We need to be responsive to investors. When they have queries, we also need to be very responsive to the environment in the house. I mean, I can't even send a a tradesperson there that doesn't have a blue card, yellow card, and perhaps has not done an induction of some kind. So the house environment is very controlled. And as an SDA provider, we're at the front and center of that. So if we, as the provider, are connected to the participants and to their stakeholders, OTs, support coordinators, planners, SIL providers, the carers, then we can get better data off the ground, and we can provide an environment where people can live their best lives. So in terms of all of that, yes, you can build a house that is a minimum standard compliance, but I can tell you that if you build something and put the money in earlier to build something that's outstanding, that is really fit for purpose, that a participant will identify, this is the way you can de-risk your investment, whilst it will never be zero. If you combine those elements when you do your research, then your risk will be very minimized. And since the 1st of July, I believe that the new funding solutions minimize your risk even lower, because now, instead of looking to fill that house with tenancy, we can now place maybe 1 or 2 people in that house. And of course, that is probably more revenue than what it was prior to the 1st of July. So I would hope that instead of thinking, oh, that's great, we've got greater percentage returns now, I would like you to think that now, from our perspective, we'd want you to say yes to every tenant that came to those houses. And now with this increased funding, we're hoping that you will, and you will be able to say yes more often and help us provide houses in areas where participants need it so they can live their best lives. Look, that's really, I'll just finish on one thing, and that is the 3 elements which you need. And I am like a broken record: the right location, the right design, and of course, the right SDA provider who's connected to participants in a way that they will choose them to be governing that house for the next potentially 20 years. And that's why we need transparency as an SDA provider. From the moment I meet people who want to help us build houses, well, if the land developer sells you the block, they're not going to contact you again. They don't care what you do with the land. But for someone who's an investor dealing with us as an SDA, potentially that's a 20-year relationship. So we've got to be absolutely transparent and be very clear about everything in this space, which, if you want to contact me, it's a much longer conversation than what we've had today. Thanks, Debbie.
Thanks so much, Brad and Angad. I think that we've had a lot of questions coming in, which we've been answering as we go. I want to ask you firstly a question of both of you. We've been talking about, in general, the Perth market. Where do you see are the highest demand areas? And I guess take into account the availability of land and demand of participants that have funded and haven't got anywhere to go.
Well, I can sort of answer that in the same way I was speaking before. If you're someone who's going to help us build a house, ideally, you would build as close as you can to the major infrastructure. But however, being near a hospital, being near, say, a shopping centre and some accessible parks, some lifestyle infrastructure, that's what participants will choose, certainly above something that was way, way out, 30 minutes away. We would never encourage it to be that far from a hospital. So the areas around Perth, you could nearly draw a circle and identify where the hospitals are, where these bigger infrastructure areas are. And I mean, even in Mandurah, we've been supportive of that. Even though that's 45 minutes up the road from Perth, it's connected by an extremely good highway and rail system. But I've noticed when I visited Mandurah, there is a disability centre there. And even the lifesavers in Mandurah, they roll mats down on the beach because they're aware there are quite a few people who are living there with disability and others who are moving for a sea change, just like you or I would do. So the areas need to be considered as to what sort of infrastructure is around them. And look, sometimes though, there might be a greenfield estate that is there and it's just not possible to find a block of land in as close as we would like. But of course, participants will have to come to where these houses are being built. And I've noticed they are doing that, because if you're funded for SDA, you need to utilize it. So the areas that are the closest are also the ones, you know, that we see being chosen. I mean, Angad would have a better view on that because his world is right there. We need a block of land to build a house.
Yeah, look, I can't agree more with everything that you said. Luckily in Perth, we've got great infrastructure throughout. We have several, you know, major general hospitals, and all of the products that we're producing are in proximity to those. Mandurah is a great little hub, as you've mentioned, and you know, there's a lot of opportunity out there as well. A couple of things I will add, I guess, is that there's a strong requirement for a local amenity. So, you know, it's one thing to talk about an area like Mandurah. It's very different to talk about a block on a street next to a shopping center or a medical center, right? So when you're looking at these properties, it's not just whether it is in a certain region, it's actually more, how will this individual that's living here, how will they access or get access to, you know, a grocery store and things like that. So very, very important. You have to look at the block for what it is, no matter where it is. You still have to look at the block. Another thing I will add is that there is a strong connection that a participant has with the provider, as Brad has outlined. And I think where this is going to go is that where providers are providing an outstanding service, say, for example, if they're organizing a community of individuals that live in their SDAs to organize and have a meeting or do some capacity building or to have a group activity, those are the types of things that people choose. Whether it's on this street or that street, in my experience, is mattering less and less, because people are feeling, as they become part of a community, yes, you need the basic infrastructure, the hospitals and the shops and all the rest of that, but pretty much anywhere in Perth has that at this stage, right? It's really about getting that local amenity. That individual block has a good outlook. It's not onto a main road. It's not looking at a power line. Getting the local amenity right, and then combining with a good care provider who can really round out the service that's being offered as a whole for that dwelling.
Great. Thanks for that, Angad. We've got a lot of questions that have come through. People have been asking about how to find the participants. Are they guaranteed? Now, we always say no, there's never a guarantee in this. There's no guarantee, even if you have participants, that they're going to stay. They may, you know, these participants often have a lower life expectation. So chances are that in a 20-year period, they might not be around in 20 years' time. They might unfortunately pass away after 5 years. You might even have a participant-led package where the dwelling is being designed by the builder with a provider, with a participant or participants lined up in mind. It might take 12, 18 months for that property to actually come to fruition, by which time that participant has found something else and they've gone. There is no guarantee really realistically there. Just maybe some thoughts around that, just to clear up investors'
It's a
minds.
really good question, Debbie. And I can say to you that if you could be present when we've moved people into these homes, knowing the institutionalized environments that some of them have come from, they find these houses and they lock onto them. And one of the questions I often get asked is, do people move around? Do they jump from house to house? This is not true. It is such a transition to move someone with complex needs from the environment they're in into that. So I would like to be engaged. Like when you can tell me 100% that the house is going ahead, because that gives us the full 7 to 9 months of the build. Look, not just to find people, participants for the home, but to match the personalities. And this is something that is critical. Now, it's not an exact science, making sure that people will get on for the next term of their life, but you can certainly tell the people who don't get on together. And we would try to not put those behaviors in together, or those participants. in together. But if we've been given the full 7 to 9 months of the build to do what we do as a provider that finds participants, you know, we have not failed to have tenants at the end of the build. And for that, oh, look, there's been occasions when the NDIS has slowed us down and we haven't been able to move tenants in at that point in time. The NDIA is another complete story. We would dearly love them to be a little bit more speedy in the way they correspond and communicate with us. But look, we've had, I think, 11 people leave our houses. But look, all of those people were at God's calling. Nobody left willingly. And one of the other questions we have is, in case you don't know, the NDIA actually continues to pay the full rent if someone has passed away in a dwelling, and that gives us an opportunity to replace them or find another participant suitable for the home. And I often get asked about lease breaks, like people breaking leases, but we just have not seen that. I haven't seen that in, we've had look, 1 or 2 occasions when disabilities have become worse than when they first moved in the house, and that has caused the home to have non-compatible behaviors involved, and we've had to move people out, you know, because of that. But we don't find people sort of breaking leases and going interstate, or which we actually thought might have happened, but we don't see that. So this jumping around or this guarantee word, of course there are no guarantees, but that's just going to lead me back to my original statement of, like a broken record: get the right location, get the right design, get the right SDA provider. And of course, there's nothing more you can do to de-risk that element, especially given the new solutions. So see, I am like a broken record, Debbie.
Absolutely. A couple of other questions I've just seen come through. Just for those people who don't actually know who we are, NDIS Property Australia, we are not a provider ourselves. We are just an advisory service. We're actually a real estate agent because we sell property. We don't work like a regular real estate agent. We only do NDIS. So we're just here to advise and consult and educate people, basically. Other questions that have been coming through. I just
Debbie,
saw something there.
I might just,
yeah.
If I could, I would just like to add some comments to the question of guarantees.
Absolutely, please do. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that's a really, really important question. I'm not sure who asked it, but great question. And I think there is a message out there, not from NDIS Property Australia, but through some other people who sell these properties and profit from the sale of these properties. And the message sounds something like this: that this is a government-backed scheme guaranteed for 20 years rent and all the rest of these things, which is completely untrue. And frankly, it's unethical and well, possibly criminal. There's actually an ASIC investigation on this subject exactly at the moment, because the risks of these dwellings are not being properly discussed or addressed. Now, the reality is that if someone is seeking a risk-free return, then the expectation of the return that they get is far lower than what is being provided for these dwellings. So if you did want someone to provide a guarantee, then that would come at the expense of, well, a lot of the upside of these dwellings. Is there a risk? Is there ways that we can mitigate the risk? Absolutely. And I think as smart investors, developers, providers, all of the rest of that, this entire game is about mitigating risk. If you're in property, that's the thing, right? How do you have your product stand out from the bunch? How do you provide a greater service? How do you attract a market that isn't available to others? So all of these things, which Brad has already discussed at length, that is your number one way to mitigate risk. However, there are other ways to mitigate risk which haven't been discussed yet. And the first one is what's called a provider head lease. Yeah. Now, this comes in some of our packages, especially the infill locations, which are provider-led. On occasion, a provider does offer what is a guarantee in the form of a head lease for that property. It's when I say guarantee, what I mean is that they will give you a fixed rent, regardless of whether the property is full or empty. And really, it's up to them how they use the dwelling. It's just a commercial lease, like if someone was renting an office space, right? Now, those tend to be a percentage of the rent. So it might be 60% or 70%. The return to the investor is typically a lot lower than what is when the investor takes the vacancy risk. And generally in those types of scenarios, you know, people are purchasing like commercial properties in the range of 7 to 8%. When a provider is providing a fixed rent, and then obviously the provider will collect the income from the SDA, and that becomes their revenue. Does that make sense? So there are some ways to mitigate risk. A lot of that comes through the quality of the design. There are some commercial ways to mitigate risk through the use of head leases and things like that, but they're very uncommon. And it does come at the expense of the returns that are being that are offered or available. Obviously, if someone's taking the risk, then they want to take that return. So yeah, just thought I wanted to add that. It's such a good question. I just didn't want to let that go.
Yeah,
Thanks.
great. Thank you, Angad. Had another couple of questions come up regarding the lifetime of an SDA investment. How long is the scheme for? The scheme is ongoing. A property has a 20-year period to receive SDA payments on any tenants in place from 20 years of first certificate of occupation. However, I believe that is going to be changed to 20 years from the first payment received for a tenant, as per the most recent price guide review recommendations. So that was just another question that came through on that. What else have we got?
I see some questions about head leases here.
Yes, there are.
All right, let me just address this, right? So by the way, guys, when you enter into a commercial head lease, that is a type of relationship with a provider that is not typical. And for a provider to trust you as the developer so that they give you a head lease takes a really strong relationship with you and the provider. You know, a head lease, by the way, whatever they put on paper, if that business goes bankrupt, your head lease is worth nothing. So just be careful about when you are engaging businesses in this fashion. Another thing I will say is about some people are asking, do most leases involve head leases? And let's draw a distinction here. In WA, at least, it's actually illegal to manage someone's property without a licensed property manager, without being a licensed real estate agent to manage properties, right? So the way providers who maybe not property managers are able to do this is through the use of a head lease model. So they take a head lease over your property, and that is what we call a flow-through head lease. That head lease just facilitates the income to flow through them into you, and they can provide a service for that property. Most of those still pass on the vacancy risk to the investor. So, you know, yes, it's a head lease, but at the same time, if it's sitting vacant, you're not getting income. So most of the head leases that you hear about in the NDIS and SDA property space are actually that type of head lease, not the commercial head lease that we were just mentioning as a way to mitigate risk and obviously in exchange for some of the returns.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that clarification, Angad.
Can I say that we actually have looked at this head lease situation across the board, and from my perspective, what I do is we have a joint venture, and we do attach a head lease because there was a situation some time ago with the NDIS where one of the owners went mortgagee in possession, and of course the bank was able to go through and take possession, and then for whatever reason banks do, they wanted vacant possession, as they typically do. Now, because there was no head lease, that was able to happen, and it kind of breaches our mandate. Our mandate is to ensure that the participants are looked after as best they can be. So we do a head lease just to stop that one thing happening, that because a bank will have to sell the property if they want to, with that intact. I mean, in our agreements, if you're selling the property, we just attach our agreement to the property sale contract, because our agreement is with the participant. Our mandate is to make sure the participant is okay. So most of the providers that I know these days are doing a head lease, and we do the property management as well in our world as well, because we want to, and not for any commercial reason, we want to have good eyes on the house, and property manager can actually access the house instantly in an emergency within 24 hours notice, you know, for just about anything. And that allows us to have better eyes, because with due respect to real estate agents out there, we look at things like, well, there might be a glance, there might be some body language that says, hey, there's something not quite right in there. So we want to make sure our staff are the ones doing those inspections, and it gives us extra access, the smoke alarms, the fire extinguisher, the termite inspections, giving access. It just helps us keep a better eye on that house, because that's what we are supposed to do to ensure participants are living the best life. So the head leases do come in various forms, but there has been a move to do that. But everyone needs to realize that even though there is a head lease, that is for us to assume to be the owner, because we can't do the mandate of that role with the NDIS as really their eyes and ears on that house. We can't do that role unless we assume to be the owner. So we do that with a head lease for $1. We normally, a head lease would have 90,000 plus outgoings in there, but we just need to consummate a commercial head lease. And what we do then is sublet to the tenants. And we do see, look, I must say, we see leases originally just for 1 or 2 years, because there's this moment in time when if you are a parent and you have a child who can have SDA funding, and by a child, I mean someone who could be 30, 40, 50 years old. Now, if that family is moving on in life, there's a point, I've witnessed this many times, there's a point, and it's such an emotional time where you have to let go to see that they are set up for the rest of their lives, but you're also looking forward to maybe, what happens if you're not there. And so we do see leases where people sign them maybe for a year to have a look to see how it goes with their child in an SDA house. And then when it goes well, which it always seems to do, you then see them signing for a greater length of time to make sure that then everybody's looked after and everyone feels comfortable with that. So there is as many variations as you can think of out there in the way different SDA providers do it. And of course, you just have to do your due diligence on that. Simple.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Brad. I'll just answer a couple more quick questions that came in on other topics. I did mention at the beginning of this webinar, but for maybe some of you who came in later, we will be sending a recording of this out to everybody who attended. We've been asked, are there any options for properties in Victoria and Tasmania? We actually have another webinar coming up on the 11th of September in a couple of weeks' time on the Tasmania, South Australia and Victoria market, for those of you who are interested in that. And I think we've well and truly run out of time. So thank you for everyone who has stuck around. Or just one more, do we get accurate supply and demand data for areas? Yes, there are different organisations that can provide you with data reports. We are one of them. So if you want to have intel on that, on specific areas, please contact us about that. But any last words, Angad and Brad, before we sign off for today?
No, I just want to say thank you to everybody for attending. Really appreciate that. There's some really great questions that were coming out. I can see that people are really thinking about, SDA and what we're doing. I also just want to say thank you to yourself for having me, and Brad for being here too. If anyone's interested in what we do more of, or looking at our packages, please reach out to Min, and we can go from there.
Absolutely.
Look, I'm very much the same. Thanks for everybody coming along. I always want to take an opportunity to at least, take away some of the myth that's been out there. And I really thank you for the invitation to do so, Debbie. Look, it is a complex conversation, but if anyone does, I'm quite open. If you want to call me on 0418 57 58 59, I'm happy to have a much longer conversation than we're able to have here, because there is a lot more to it. But hopefully this conversation helps you, help us by building a few more houses in areas where we need them for participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brad. And thank you both, Angad and Brad, for your time today and imparting us with some very, very useful information. If anybody does have any more questions that we haven't answered today, please give us a call here at NDIS Property Australia. The number's 1300 254 397, or you can email us at info@ ndis.property. As I did say, we have another webinar coming up in a couple of weeks, and we will get that information out to everybody. We'll be sending the recording of this along in the next couple of days. So thank you very much for your time today, all, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much, Debbie.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.